had to throw this in. Anybody notice anything different about the two pictures? Partially clean. I haven't finished. I've only got about 2/3 of the way up. Look at the top. Well, thank you. Look at the top of that capstone on the left-hand picture. Notice it's off-centered. It had shifted by about 6 inches. That was the first thing that took me out of the Thomas Sumter site. The lead seal had completely gone from that 1907 monument. Water had gotten underneath it, and through freeze-thaw action had moved that big granite capstone 6 inches off. And I found another earlier slide that had it moving back the other way. So we were able to get a third-generation monument builder to get back out there, move that capstone back into place using modern materials, but around the edge of the cap, he used lead caulking, similar to the original lead that was out there. Go to the next slide, please. Within those management challenges, we also have some tough choices to make. We have to set priorities. Sometimes we have to work at a site that people think, well, that's not the most important site. The site that I like is the most important site. Well, it's almost like triage. We have to go out and work at a site where the damage is more likely to occur. This is Rose Hill Plantation State Historic Site Cemetery. The brick wall that you see there in the foreground around that inner enclosure, almost all gone. The brick wall in the background, the corner of it is completely missing. It is tilting in and it is threatening a number of stones there. So that's going to become a priority of mine in the very near future. We are providing guidance to our people in the field by trying to, yes, finish her up. We're trying to provide guidance through management policies that provide the overall guidance for all historic cemeteries. And on particular historic cemeteries, we are trying to develop specific management plans that address the very specific management needs of those sites. Our historic burial sites exist in a system of 46 state parks and historic sites, all competing for scarce funds. And at the moment, we generate over 73% of our operating budget. It's all self-generated. Working with limited staff, limited time, and we're also working within this larger political system, which, like it or not, affects much of what we do. And then the Revolutionary War burial sites are only 3 burial sites that we have in our system. We've identified at least 20 separate burial sites on our parks, with perhaps as many as 300 or more known headstones. And Francis Marion site is in relatively good condition. As I said, it has not been altered. Rose Hill, as you saw from that photograph, is very precarious. All of these sites, the 3 revolutionary sites, are all very remote from the parks that manage them. They range from 30 minutes to 45 to 60-minute drives one way for the park staff to get out there and manage them. And that remoteness makes it difficult for those park staffs to manage them. And again, these are not people who are cemetery specialists. I'm the only tombstone specialist in the state park service. I'm spread pretty thin. And so because of their remoteness, we have additional problems. The Francis Marion burial site has a hunt club around it, as does the Isaac Hayes. If you go out there during deer season, you're liable to hear gunshots. And so we have visitor safety concerns. The Thomas Sumter site is in a suburban area. And it's very nice because the people who live in the neighborhood like to use it for walking and jogging and going out and strolling. But also there's a loop driveway that you go in, and it loops down and out of sight. And who likes to use that? People who are dealing drugs. People who are doing all sorts of other criminal activities. So we have another management problem there through our access. So we're working to address all these needs at our sites, and we are working to make you folks more aware of them, because that will, if you're aware of the problems, the challenges that we face in managing these sites, we think you'll be able to support us better. At the Isaac Hayes site, for instance, we're just a few $100s shy of matching a grant that we've received for the interpretive improvements that we want to have out there. If you'd like to donate to that effort, we can tell you how to do it. In the very near future, when I can finish our condition assessment at the Francis Marion burial site, we'll have a better sense of what it is we want to do and what we want to do first. We'll have our priorities in line and maybe have some cost estimates. We can come back to the public and say, we need help on this. Because if you know what we are facing, our challenges, we feel like we can do a much better job. You'll be supporting us, you'll know who does what, and you'll know just the difficulties that we face, and we need help. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Again, thank you for coming out and sharing with us, doing what you do.
I first met her in '96 when Judge said, you must hear this. And so I went, and what I heard astounded me. And my question was, do you have all this written down and are you going to publish it? And she said, yes. We were hoping the book would be available this week. It is not. Those of you who know publishers understand that perfectly. It's never ready when they say it should be. The book will be called Awesome Women Lost in History. It's the First Works Publishing from out of Atlanta, and on my husband's table, he has information on that book. You must have it. You gentlemen should read it before you give it to your independent wives. The women will love it. I was expecting a few women who were different. She doesn't have a few or a few dozen. She has a tremendous number of women that will boggle your mind. And because we want to give her as much time as we can, she's here today to give you just a taste of what the women were doing in what you thought was a man's world. Here is Leslie Sackrison.
Good afternoon, folks. Can you all hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to apologize. I was told no notes, and guess what? My nerves and, well, I used to be gone, have preceded me, and I have to use some notes. Before we can discuss non-traditional, we better define traditional. The dictionary states it's the passing down of a culture from generation to generation or a custom handed down. Therefore, traditional roles in the 18th century would be what? Wife, childbearing, knitting, tatting, weaving, field work, and the list can go on. The female child, when brought into this world, was not celebrated. She was not an heir. She had no legacy and definitely no honors. Women were used to keep the house a home for the menfolk and to procreate. There were no laws protecting the women as there are today, and that she was a non-entity, especially if she was married. She was sometimes referred to as chattel, which is defined as a movable object of tangible property. She could not make a contract, could not be sued or sue. She could not execute a deed, hold or sell property, or administer an estate without the express permission of her husband. This was usually not the case, however, if she was single or widowed. What then could persuade, force, influence, compel a woman to go into a non-traditional role? Perhaps it was by choice. It may have been that the woman was a spinster or in need of some extra urgent income. Possibly the decision was made because of a death in the family and the need to carry on a family business, either before or after they were married. Reasons could be found in siding in a war or for social and or economic income. On land, their pay was usually less than a man's, and if she was married, she had no control over the frequency of the pay. Disguised as a man, the freedom to learn new things opened up to a woman who was believed to be a man. Popular recorded history fails to showcase the contributions of woman. It was a man's world. The cliche behind every great man is a woman only starts to recognize the contributions of women. There were famous, infamous, and unknown women who aided at many turns, but most of history is aligned towards the male gender. Occasionally the wife or the mistress or the daughter would be written about some sort of feat that they accomplished, but usually it was in his name. However, what most history does not do is expound upon the women who accomplished something in their own right. Some of their stories are known, some are waiting still to be found out. Diaries have been lost or waiting to be found. Or sometimes the accomplishment and the woman was just not readily known. More to the fact that some of these women had no man. Oh, imagine that. Women in non-traditional roles did not fit the stereotype. The stereotype, of course, being prim and proper, quiet. These particular women had strength in their character. They had a feistiness and a determination and a willingness to do what must be done. Were they always prepared? Probably not. Did they have a choice? Possibly not. Were records kept as they are nowadays or even a century ago? Definitely not. Women had to be strong, tough, independent, courageous, and a survivor. They kept their cool and did what they needed to do in order to stay alive. Sometimes it was just the woman against an element, be they Indians, hunger, or fire. Sometimes the women could and would band together to get something accomplished, such as in 1765 when they banded together to boycott British-made goods of tea and cloth. Later they banded together for the suffragette movement. Advertisements in the 18th century newspapers tell us that widows continued family enterprises in such thoroughly male occupations as coachmaking, shipbuilding, rigging, and horseshoeing. Though we know nothing else about these women, we can assume that they learned their crafts working with the men, and when they passed away, continued the business under their own name. Center Street, which is a part of the business district in Nantucket, became known as Petticoat Row because of the preponderance of female shopkeepers. Isolated examples of women passing as men appear prior to the 16th century through the 18th century. There were hundreds of women soldiers and sailors passing as men, and everyone knew about it. From January through May of 1757, a woman using the name of Arthur Douglas served aboard the Resolution. In 1762, an Englishman joked that there are so many disguised women that were serving in the Army that they ought to have their own regiment. Questions have been raised and not happily answered in regards to certain female characteristics, such as urination, menstruation, and the concealing of breasts. It's been documented that some of these women carried some sort of tube. In the early 1700s, it was noted that Katharina Lincoln had a leather-covered horn which she carried fastened to her nude body. Christiana Davies, who was an Englishwoman, carried a silver tube, and she learned that from another female soldier. Some women bound their breasts. Some have been suggested that they concealed having their period or ceased having their period due to the athletic nature of the jobs that they were doing. They suffered from the hard work and or poor diet. Others have suggested that they told story of ailments such as syphilis and gonorrhea. And it has also been suggested that some of these women depicted a 5 o'clock shadow with the use of charcoal. When Revere, as well as other couriers, relayed the news of the battles of Lexington and Concord, men left their wives in charge of their shops, their farms, gristmills, and taverns, and set on foot or on horseback to the Boston area. Women of all ages used molds, lead, and iron spoons to make bullets for the upcoming battles. The women also aided in the making of gunpowder. They would mix the lye with the water to make saltpeter, and then add the charcoal and sulfur to make the gunpowder. In 1738, Catherine Hoof married Jonas Green. He was a printer employed by Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Bradford. They moved later to Annapolis, where Jonas became the printer to the province of Maryland. Starting in January 1745, The Maryland Gazette was published with Anne's help. In April of 1767, Jonas died, but the Gazette continued. This made Anne the first woman in America to run a print shop. That year, she also published the acts and votes and proceedings of the Provincial Assembly on schedule. In June of 1768, she was officially appointed the provincial printer, which she continued until her death in 1775, printing books, papers, almanacs, and pamphlets. On December 11, 1735, Sarah Updike married Dr. Giles Goddard, and they moved to Connecticut. 22 years later, Giles died. William, their son, completed an apprenticeship with James Parker, and Sarah moved to Rhode Island to finance William's printing press, the first in the state. The first issue of the Providence Gazette was issued on October 20th, 1762. William suspended the operation of the paper in May of 1765, and starting August 9th, 1766, Sarah, with the help of her daughter Mary Catherine, restored the Providence Gazette as publisher and editor and kept it running through 1768. This endeavor made these two ladies the first female publishers in America. In 1768, William convinced his mother to sell the print shop and move to Philadelphia. Sarah continued to help William with the press until she passed away. Mary Catherine also went with her mother and William to Philadelphia, and when William moved on to Baltimore, Mary continued the Philadelphia printing press on her own. In 1764, she sold the business and moved to Baltimore and took over from William the printing business he had established there. In 1775, she became the editor and publisher of the Maryland Journal and the Baltimore Advertiser. That same year, she also became postmaster of Baltimore. It was probably the first woman in this position. In 1777, she was commissioned by Congress to publish the first printed copy of the Declaration of Independence with the signers' names. Mary and William argued in 1784, and William took over. She remained, however, as the postmaster until 1789, when someone could be appointed to overtake the traveling that was involved. Mary operated a bookstore until 1810. Margaret Green Draper inherited the Boston Newsletter from her husband when he died in 1773. She used the paper to support the Loyalist cause and had to flee to England in 1776 when the British evacuated Boston. Hannah and Sarah Ledyard were co-owners of a paper mill. In January 1778, the paper mill burned. It supplied the paper to the Hartford Courant, which was co-owned by the widow Hannah Watson, and George Goodwin. Without newsprint, the paper announced that its last publication would be on February 3rd. The Ledyards appealed to the State Assembly for aid, and within hours, a statewide lottery was established. Enough money was made, and the mill was rebuilt. The newspaper, the only paper under colony hands, was able to continue. In 1768, because of the dangerous conditions at Gunnet Point, which is part of Plymouth Bay, Massachusetts, the colony offered to rent John and Hannah Thomas's land, build a lighthouse on it, and pay John an annual salary of 200 pounds. In 1776, John left to fight in the war, and Hannah took over the keeping of the light. This made her the first female lightkeeper. Sometime between 1776 and 78, a makeshift fort was built around the lighthouse to protect it from the English. In 1768, a battle ensued around the lighthouse, and a wild cannon shot hit the lighthouse but did no damage to the light. Hannah kept the light burning for an additional 8 years. There are no written records of lighthouses or their keepers for the next 50 years. Therefore, nothing else is really known, including whether John made it back from the war or not. The widow Austin in 1772 operated a ferry across the Delaware. Catherine Park advertised as a tanner in 1781 in Richmond, Virginia. In Boston, Mary Jackson was a tinker making tea kettles, coffee pots, brass and copper saucepans, and other kettles. In 1775, she advertised the fact that she now sold powder, shot, and flints at the Brazen Head. The night of Paul Revere's ride alerting the townspeople that the British were coming showed a recorded incident of Betsy the blacksmith carrying bandages to the wounded after the British were routed. She also saw that 6 brass cannons were left behind by the British. She told Sam Leverett, and the two of them went out and fetched them, and within 6 weeks had repaired them and turned them over to the American commander. Betsy was also proficient in the use of herbs and roots and used them to help the wounded. Evidently, prior to the Revolutionary, Dorcas Griffiths was the mistress to John Hancock before he was married, and a businesswoman. She had a shop on Hancock's Wharf selling groceries, linen, tea, and liquor. She left with Captain David Johnstone of the British Marines, following him to his home in 1774. When she got to England, she put in a claim for property loss due to loyalty to the crown and was awarded an allowance. In 1775, Catherine Smith built a gristmill and a sawmill at the mouth of the White Deer Creek. When the Revolutionary War broke out, she added a mill for boring gun barrels. In 1779, British Allied Indians attacked and burned everything to the ground. 6 years later, she petitioned the General Assembly in Philadelphia for salvage of her property. Anna Brown on Long Island during the Revolutionary War carried on her late husband's tavern business to support a large family of orphan grandchildren. Rebecca Mott agreed to the destruction of her seaside mansion to aid in the recapture of Fort Mott. She supplied the arrows to set her home on fire. The British evacuated quickly and most of the house was saved. By the end of the war, all the monies were gone and she was widowed and she needed to start again. Against the advice of others, she bought some uncleared land on the edge of the Santee, which she felt was good for the raising of rice. Evidently, her endeavors proved very good due to the fact that when she died, she left a very large estate. Keziah Coffin posed as a Tory during the Revolutionary War to get supplies to Nantucket. There she created a monopoly and took advantage of the residents. When the residents couldn't pay, she took a mortgage out on their property, and she did lose everything after the war. Colonel Ferguson and Captain Dunlap, with a party of Tories, stopped at Mrs. Dillard's house, demanding first information and then food. While preparing the food, she overheard Ferguson state that he had just received word as to the location of Clark's group with whom her husband was with, and that they would leave as soon as they ate and attack them. Once the supper had been laid, Mrs. Dillard mounted a horse and made haste to Clark's encampment and warned them. They had prepared themselves just in time, as Colonel Ferguson had detached Dunlap with 200 men to engage and keep them busy until his arrival. However, they were repelled, chased, but not caught. Mary Murray detained General Howe and his officers with food, wine, and song until she was sure General Putnam could make an orderly retreat and join General Washington. General Nathaniel Greene needed to get a message to General Sumter. Where no soldier would volunteer because the hillsides were alive with Tories, Emily Geiger volunteered. She committed the message to memory, as well as carried the message per General Greene. A British scout stopped Emily, and while he sent for a matron to search her, she tore the note up and swallowed it. She was let go and continued on her way. Arriving the next day, she told the general of Greene's needs. Jane Black married John Thomas in 1740. During the Revolutionary War, her husband and 2 sons were captured and held prisoner at 96. During one of her visits, she overheard talk as the Loyalists intended on paying a surprise visit to the rebels at Cedar Spring the following night. She soon left her family with the news and got to the rebels to prepare a reception. Early in the war, Governor Rutledge deemed the Thomas household a depot of arms and ammunition. A detachment of 25 soldiers was left to keep watch. Word came that the Tories, led by Colonel Moore, were advancing. All save one soldier packed up as much arms and munitions and left, leaving one soldier, Josiah Culbertson, a son-in-law, to defend with Jane and her children. When the Tories fired, they returned the fire of the Tories continuously, but because Jane and her daughters kept reloading for the son-in-law. Believing there to be more soldiers in the house, they quit the house. Sumter's army in the battles of Rocky Mount and Hanging Rock used the powder that was saved. At an early age, Patience Lovell displayed the ability to create models of her friends, first in flour and in putty, then in beeswax. She married Joseph Wright, and when he died, leaving the 3 children to support, she moved to London in 1772. That was her. She set up an exhibition and became the rage of London society. She was the first American to become a professional sculptor. During that time, she used her connections and influence to spy for the rebels and passed on the information to Benjamin Franklin in Passy, France. From British records dated in 1778, a female agent who sold thread and other supplies to Washington's army was reported as one of his best. Her name is not known, but she would meander around Washington's quarters and eavesdrops. On the same token, one of Washington's agents, who's only known by her code name of 355, worked extremely well until Benedict Arnold switched allegiances. She was arrested and imprisoned on the ship Jersey, where she gave birth to a child and subsequently died 5 months later. Sarah McCullough followed her husband during the Revolutionary War until his capture at Brandywine. She ran their farm and negotiated for their release. While he was encouraged to visit and gather information for the Army. Kate Moore was married to Captain Andrew Barry and would act as a courier. She would also help round up men for skirmishes and did so for General Daniel Morgan so that they won the Battle of Cowpens. Ludicia Langston was a Whig messenger. She was an expert shot and rider. She is credited with saving many lives, and a monument is erected to her in Greenville, South Carolina. Mary Grant was also called Molly. From 1759 to 1774, she was the consort of Sir William Johnson and the superintendent of who was the superintendent of Indian affairs for the northern colonies. Her brother Joseph was one of the most noted Iroquois warriors of the American Revolution. During the war, she informed the British of the Patriot movements before the Battle of Oriskany in August of 1777. Got your attention yet? When her spying was found out, she hid with relatives in the Six Nations. When the war was over, she moved to Canada, and in 1783, she was granted a pension of £100 annually from the British for services rendered. From 1759 to 1771, Mary Lacey served in the Navy as William Candler. She ran away from her domestic work in her late teens. Making her way in mail clothing to Chatham, she was asked if she wanted to go to the sea aboard the Sandwich, a 90-gun ship, newly launched and not fully crewed. England at this point was in the 3rd year of the 7 Years' War against France and was desperate for men. She rose in status from a carpenter servant, which she served at for 7 years, to a qualified shipwright. She published her autobiography, The History of the Female Shipwright, in 1773. William Prothero served aboard a 32-gun ship, the Amazon, from 1760 to 61. Her real name is unknown, but it's recorded in 3 different sources that he was a she. She was found out on April 20th, 1761, after serving 9 months per the captain's records and 5 months per the muster's record. Either case, she was shown being discharged on April 30th. In 1771, 24 lashes were ordered for the desertion of Charles Woodall. When stripped to the waist, he was found out to be a she. Having gone to sea after her love, she had heard that he was aboard the Oxford and joined. Upon finding out that he was not, she left. She gave no explanation as to why she continued dressing in male clothing after leaving. While on board the HMS Apollo, Eleanor Moore, during a battle with a French frigate on June 15, 1780, was wounded whilst performing her duties as powder monkey. She wrote petitioning the Chatham Chest for a pension. The governors wrote the Admiralty, and on August 11th, less than 2 months later, though a precedent was not set, she was awarded. Dicey Langston was a patriot as well as her brother, though some of her relatives were loyalists. Dicey found it was easy to get information and passed it on to her brother, whose home was across the Inouye River. Suspicion was eventually aroused, and her father was told her to keep her in check, which she did for a while, until she heard about the group, the Bloody Scout, coming to visit. She crossed the Inouye River, which was swollen because of the rains, and she delivered the message. And by the time that the Bloody Scout got there, they found no enemy. Anna Strong, during the Revolution, operated on Long Island Sound with one of the largest and well-organized spy rings, the Culpeper Ring. It was signaled that the coast was clear of the British by hanging a black petticoat and a certain number of white handkerchiefs on her clothesline. In 1745, Hannah Snell went to sea after her estranged husband, who had abandoned her when she was 6 months pregnant. The child died soon after he was born, and so she set after him. As James Gray, she served aboard the British sloop, the HMS Swallow. She took part on the siege of Pondicherry in 1748. She was severely wounded and spent almost a year in the hospital, where she was still able to maintain her male disguise. Whenever she was challenged about not being masculine enough, she answered her by challenging her accuser to beat her at any shipboard task. In August of 1749, she was assigned to the Tartar while waiting for a reassignment, which happened 2 months later. She was reassigned to the Alfam, and in May of 1750, when the ship returned to Spithead, she was paid off, announced her true identity, and discharged. She did receive a pension from the Crown. She did publish The Female Soldier, or The Surprising Adventures of Hannah Snell. In 1778, still in men's clothing, she was seen as a peddler outside of Norfolk. She's also been noted at running an inn called The Female Soldier and appearing on state in uniform. In 1780, using the name of William Henry Renee, Anna Marie Reel followed her lover to sea. She acquired this trade of tailor while aboard the ship and continued it afterwards in men's clothing. In 1781, at the age of 17, George Thompson was found out to be Margaret Thompson. A theft aboard the ship started a search. They found female clothing in her chest and assumed that she was guilty. George was sentenced to the lash. At this point, Margaret revealed herself. When asked, she admitted to being compelled to see her lover in Bombay. Up until that time, no one had known. She had performed all tasks, including dangerous ones such as climbing the rigging. In 1782, there was a report of a Mrs. Cole who had served aboard several man-of-war ships as a sailor. Fanny Campbell was from Lynn, Massachusetts. She went to sea disguised as a man because of her love, William Lovell, who was in jail in Cuba. Charged with piracy, she set to sea serving as a second officer on the English merchant brig the Constance. She was able to further the distrust of the captain and the first mate and successfully led a mutiny. She was appointed as commander. The Constance was intercepted several days later by a British bark, the George. They attacked the Constance, believing that they could win with superior firepower. Unfortunately for the George, they became the prize of the Constance. The two ships sailed to Cuba and successfully freed William as well as 10 other Americans. Back at sea, the two ships caught another prize, a British merchant ship, which carried the news that England and America were at war. So as not to be labeled a pirate, the crew's only alternative was to get privateer papers. Sailing back towards Marblehead, they caught a British sloop of war. William and Fanny went back to Lynn and married. Privateer papers were drawn up, and William went back to sea. However, Fanny remained to raise eventually a very large family. A British observer who met a Southern woman who had served as a soldier was told by the men that her sex was notorious to all the regiment, but no notice was taken of it so long as she conducted herself properly. It is also said that she was not the only representative of the female sex in the ranks. A volunteer for the 81st Highland Regiment was picked up in Drumblade, Scotland in 1779. He turned out to be a she. Phoebe Hassel joined at 15 years of age and served as a private in the 5th Regiment of Foot, the Northumberland Fusiliers, for many years. In 1745, she received a bayonet wound in her arm at the Battle of Fontenoy. She also is believed to have fought at Bunker Hill. She was found out after having committed a crime and was sentenced to the lash. When her back was bared from the lash, she was found out, her sex was discovered. She was evidently honorably discharged, as she did receive a pension for her years of service. Upon her enlistment as Samuel Gay, Anne Nancy Bailey made an excellent impression on the officers, who awarded her a promotion on February 14, 1777, to a corporal in a Massachusetts regiment. However, 3 weeks later, a warrant was issued for her arrest for desertion. It read, "Please take into your custody Nancy Bailey, who dressed herself in men's clothes, enlisted as a soldier in my company in Colonel Patterson's regiment, who received 15 pounds 10 shilling bounty from the state and then absented herself. In time she was caught, the trial took place, and she was found guilty. She was fined and sentenced for 2 months and then discharged." Margaret Cochran lost her parents in an Indian raid when she was 5. She married John Corbin in 1772. She then followed him when he joined the 1st Company in Pennsylvania Artillery. She would watch her husband and the rest of the men drilling, learning the routine. At Fort Washington and on November 16, 1776, when her husband was killed during a battle, she leaped in. She was eventually seriously wounded by grape shot. She became known as Captain Molly. When she was somewhat recovered and was transferred to the Invalid Corps, the Continental Congress cited her for her bravery. In 1779, she was the first woman to receive a pension of a complete suit of clothes every year for the rest of her life. She was also included on the military records. In April of 1783, she was formally mustered out of the Continental Army and was buried at West Point with a monument dedicated to her there. Deborah Sampson, her father died at sea when she was 5 years old. Her mother was unable to make